Hey everyone, thanks for coming. Thanks again to Henrik for this fantastic series of lectures. This is the last one. We're really coming to the action, right? Because now Henrik will talk about public policy solution.
Policy non-solution. Thanks for coming again. I admire your tenacity to come and keep listening to me talking about these kinds of questions. So during the last 2 days, we have documented the importance of child penalties for gender equality. We talked a lot about how they vary across space and time. And especially on Monday, we talked quite a bit about different types of mechanisms as well, biological mechanisms, advantage stories, social norm stories, etc. I also briefly talked on Monday about public policy, but kind of stayed away from that for the most part. And today I'm really going to delve into the potential policy impacts on child penalties and gender inequality. Certainly in the public debate about these things, there's a huge amount of focus on policy solutions to this. So I'm going to start out just recapping something, the one thing I did talk about on Monday, but just sort of making a conjecture without really presenting very conclusive evidence. So what I did on Monday was to compare child penalties in the US and Denmark, specifically child penalties in employment rates, right? And so what we have overall is that child penalties in employment are considerably larger in the US than they are in Denmark. A long-run penalty of 23% in the US versus only 13% in Denmark. So, almost twice as large. Then what I pointed out on Monday is that underneath this aggregate penalty, there's some really interesting and maybe surprising heterogeneity. Was certainly surprising to me the first time I saw it. So this next graph here, there it is. Splits that aggregate penalty into the penalty on married versus single women. So the red graphs up here show child penalties for single women. The blue graphs show child penalties for married women. Or to be absolutely clear, it's single versus married for the US. Whereas in Denmark, it's cohabitating versus non-cohabitating women, which I think is probably a more relevant split in the Danish context. By the way, the Danish graph here, I am grateful to Jakob, who sits there in the back, for producing that one. So what we can see here is that this overall difference in the US and Denmark in terms of child penalties is there's something very different going on underneath. The child penalty on married women in the US is much larger than the child penalty on married or cohabiting women in Denmark. But for single women, the exact reverse is true. The long-run penalty in the US is close to 0, whereas the long-run penalty in Denmark is very large. In fact, the child penalty in single women in Denmark is 6 times larger than it is in the US. So that's a really striking difference, and we want to kind of ask, how come do we see this pattern? So what I conjectured on Monday was, so now this is delayed. So this US-Denmark child penalty symmetry. So what I conjectured on Monday is that this might have something to do with welfare benefit generosity. And the reason why I'm making that hypothesis is really because of 2 aspects. One is the recognition that someone has to pay for children. And the other aspect is the recognition that single and married women are very different in terms of their ability to specialize. So essentially, thank you. So essentially, married women can specialize in childcare while their partners pay for children, while single mothers cannot do that. And that means that single mothers have to work unless there's a welfare system that pays for their children. And so that is one possible reason why Denmark and the US may be so starkly different in terms of these child penalties on single women. Let me remind you, you probably all know that, or most of you know that in this room, that Denmark has, I think, actually literally the most generous welfare system in the world, whereas the US, on the other hand, has one of the least generous welfare systems in the developed world. So there's a very big contrast there. Now, so what I wanted to start out with was to really explore this hypothesis in more detail, so they kind of provide some more conclusive evidence that welfare policy really impacts child penalties. Now, we're talking about child penalties in employment here and an impact of welfare policies on that. That seems to really relate to something which we have a very long literature on, namely the impact of welfare policies on labor supply at the extensive margin. The outcome is a little bit different here, but it seems closely related. And in fact, it is, as I'm now going to show you. So I have a recent paper thinking about the impact of welfare policy and labor supply in the US. And I'm going to, show you a little bit from that paper and then try and link it to this topic here. So what I find very useful for thinking about this is to look at the labor force participation outcomes for single women in the US over the very long. So here's a graph from my paper. Now this is a graph that I have looked at a lot over the years and that I continue to be very fascinated by. So what it shows the labor force participation rate over half a century between 1968 and 2018. For single women with children in the US in blue and single women without children in black, right? And what you see is that over this long period, over a 50-year period, single women with and without children have evolved in virtually parallel, apart from a single spell in the mid to late 90s, approximately 5 to 6 years in the mid to late 90s. Everywhere else, they're evolving in parallel. So the gap between single women with and without children at the beginning of this period was about 14 percentage points. The gap between single women with and without children 25 years later in the early 90s was still about 25 percentage points. Then something happens in the mid to late 90s and single women with children catch up completely to single women without children. And then the two groups revert to parallel trends, but now on a different level. So whatever happened in the mid to late 90s, it was something very big and it was historic. So that makes it very interesting to understand what happened, and people have tried to understand that and didn't know a lot about it. So the main hypothesis out there is that this had to do with some important policy changes happening in the 90s, namely changes in both welfare policy and tax policy. So let me just quickly talk about some of the main policy changes that happened in that period. So one was the federal tax reform in the US enacted in 1993. So what that reform, one of the things that that reform did was to implement a really large expansion of the earned income tax credit, the EITC. So many of you probably know about the EITC, but let me quickly recap. The EITC is a tax subsidy specifically targeted to families with children. Because of the jointness of the US tax system, that is, this tax subsidy is based on the joint income of the husband and the wife. In practice, these tax subsidies are provide the strongest incentives for single parents or single women with children. So this was a big subsidy for single women with children to enter the labor market. Federal EITC reform was not the only thing that happened. Another thing that happened was the enactment of federal welfare reform in 1996. What that reform did was to drastically scale back traditional cash welfare in the US. It did so through basically making it much harder, much more restrictive to receive welfare through the imposition of things like time limits work requirements, stronger training, job search, and education requirements for people on welfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, effectively pushing most single mothers off of cash welfare. Now, federal welfare reform didn't happen in a vacuum. It was actually the culmination of state-led welfare reform efforts in the early 90s. These state welfare reforms came under the heading of so-called welfare waivers, and the majority of states in the US reformed their welfare system during this period. And what they did with these welfare reforms was a lot of the same things that were eventually implemented on a national scale in 1996. Now, so two things are happening here. There are these tax subsidies to enter the labor market, and then there's a scaling back of welfare programs, which also create an incentive to enter the labor market. And these reforms are specifically targeted to single women with children. Now, what does this have to do with child penalties? Well, it seems related, right? So what we're seeing here in the 90s is that single women with children are increasing labor supply a lot relative to single women without children. That sounds like a reduction in the child penalty, because a child penalty is, in effect, a comparison of what happens to women with children relative at positive event times relative to women without children at negative event times. So it seems close to a child penalty. What are the differences? Well, there are two differences here. At least in the ideal event study approach, we have a panel, right? So we're comparing the same woman over time before and after having kids. This is a purely cross-sectional approach. We're looking at some women with children, comparing them to other women without children, purely cross-sectional. But I spent like an hour yesterday trying to convince you that that's fine. We can use cross-sectional data to estimate child penalties. Okay, we had to do some massaging of the data, add a little bit of matching to the cross-sectional data to do that. And so we don't do that here. So this is just a raw comparison. But somehow, based on yesterday, the cross-sectional aspect of this may not be such a big issue. The other difference is that I haven't said anything here about the age of the child. Of course, the event study is really about something that's happening sharply around the event of childbirth. In other words, your labor supply is very different when you have very young children compared to when you just before having those kids. So what will be key here is to figure out, these single women with children that are increasing labor supply, are they children with teenage kids or infant kids? And so for this to translate into child penalties, these have to be women with young children that are responding. But we kind of already know that from my paper on welfare reform and labor supply, because these effects, I've shown that previously in a completely different context, is that the effects were in fact driven mainly by single women with very young children. So we're very close to a child penalty here. And let me show that a bit more rigorously. So let me simply translate these effects into an effect on the child penalty. First, just sort of the time change. So this graph here repeats the similar type of analysis that I showed you before. It's just the child penalty for single women in the US, but where the blue one is the child penalty on that group in the 20 years leading up to this welfare reform episode in the US, and the red one is the child penalty in the 10 years following that welfare reform episode. And clearly child penalties fell drastically for single women with children by about 11 percentage points. So this is just a before after. We like to do something a little more quasi-experimental, and the best control group we really have here are married women. So the natural sort of diff and diff type setting we have here is to compare child penalties over time for single women who were treated by welfare reform to the child penalties of married women who were largely or much more untreated by welfare reform. And that's basically what I've done here. So this shows the child penalty over time in the US in these 5-year intervals. And what you can see is that the child penalty for both single women in red and married women in blue, they were falling over time through the 70s and the 80s. That's consistent with what I've shown you before. They're reasonably parallel. And then after welfare reform in the 90s, there was a divergence between the two, and the child penalty for single mothers fall by 6-7 percentage points relative to married women. Yeah.
There's something compositional here that might change. That single women mean something different in the 2000s than in the 70s, right? That there are many more singles for one thing, and probably they're more highly educated and so on than they used to be.
Yes, that is absolutely true. That is true. So there are gradual changes in the education levels of both single and married women. There are gradual changes in the occurrence of single women. So yeah, so I mean, what I'm relying on, I mean, I could try and adjust for that, which I'm not doing here. The changes you're talking about are, of course, they're gradual and they're happening over the entire period. And what I'm relying on here is sort of a relatively sharp change around the specific period here. But it's true, I could try and adjust for that. And here I'm just doing the raw diff and diff.
Also like first stage effect on being a single mother.
So it's a little hard for me to hear.
Yeah, sorry. So there could be a first stage on being a single mother from the welfare reform, such that women are trapped into marriages because they no longer divorce if the welfare reform is less generous than before.
Yeah, so I mean, so that's something that there's quite a lot of work on, you know, the attempt to find impacts of tax and welfare policy on marriage and also fertility. And based on what I've seen so far, no one has really been able to come up with clear evidence that these effects are there. So, yeah.
Just one quick clarification question. So for single women, those are those that are single at birth or when they give birth, or?
Well, so here they're single at every single event. So the child penalties I'm estimating here, what underlies every single dot here is an event study along the lines of what I showed you yesterday and the day before. So I'm looking at event times -5 to +10. Because these are based on this repeated cross-section methodology I developed yesterday. It's like it's not this, you know, it's not that you're single from -5 to 10 because they're different women at every single time.
The definition is that single would be those that give birth while they're single.
No, so it's the cross-sectional method where I look at the outcomes for single women between event time -5 and 10. They're matched, but they are different women. And I'm looking, so what I'm finding here is that women who are single have positive event times. They have lower event supply than women who are single at negative event times. That's the child penalty. I'm plotting that child penalty over time, and the degree to which that happens falls from before after welfare reform to after welfare reform, compared to how much it's falling for married women who are untreated by the reform. So that's, the assumption here is a parallel trend assumption in child penalties between married and single women. And I think Niels's concern is that there are these demographic changes. They're fine as long as they're impacting child penalty similarly over time for married and single, but maybe there are some differences and that could have an impact. Honestly, I very much doubt that this is what's going to be going on, because what I've also done, and I haven't shown you, is to look a lot at heterogeneity in child penalties across different education groups, across, you know, all sorts of different dimensions. And there's not a ton of heterogeneity in a lot of these dimensions. So I'm not too concerned by that. It's, of course, in general, valid. So, okay, so this was really sort of adding some empirical meat or quasi-experimental meat to this hypothesis that I made on Monday that welfare policy is somehow important. And I think it's interesting because it's, you know, maybe perhaps an a priori surprising policy to have big effects. Now, of course, this is sort of a positive finding. That's interesting to know. Welfare policies matter for child penalties, but as we discussed on Monday, this is not something that we want to use for a policy prescription, that we want to reduce welfare benefits in order to do something with child penalties. That's clear. If we were to do that, single women with children will be made worse off. We're not helping them, even though they get a lower child penalty. They are forced to compensate with reducing their child penalty, but they are made worse off in welfare terms. And that's, of course, just the usual whether you prefer the envelope-theorem logic or revealed preference logic. But whatever logic you use, they're made worse off. Now, what I've done here is to just sort of think of what happened in the 90s as welfare reform. But it was really a package of different things, a package of tax policies really starting to provide these in-work transfers through the tax system and scaling back the welfare system. So what people have also, including myself, spent an enormous amount of energy thinking about over the years is whether these labor supply changes were really driven by welfare reform or tax policy. It's a little bit of an aside compared to what these Zeuthen lectures are about, so I'm not going to go into it, but it's something that's important both for thinking about how to design tax policy and welfare programs and for understanding labor supply behavior more broadly. Just to sort of give you my view on this, is that these employment effects in the 90s were really driven by welfare reform and not by EHC reform. One very simple way to, there are many arguments for that, I think, but one simple argument is you saw that long run graph where the relative labor force participation rates for the two groups have been very, very stable over time, apart from the 90s. Now, it's very hard to separate the effect of welfare reform from the EHC using data from the 90s because their timing overlap. It's all happening at the same time, and they're affecting single women with versus without children in similar ways. One way to separate it is to look at other time periods, and we had many other times in the US where we had EHC expansions apart from the 90s, but without welfare reform. And during those episodes, you didn't have this impact on single women with children relative to children. You kind of saw that because things were just parallel everywhere else. So that's sort of just a basic argument for this being more about welfare reform. There are other patterns in the data that point in that direction as well. Okay, so from this welfare reform point, I want to go to, I guess, what most people have thought a lot more about in this context, namely family policy, right? So once we focus on child penalties, it's very natural to think about policies that directly impact the incentives and constraints for families with young children. And there are really two main types of family policies that we think about here. One is parental leave policy, and the other one is childcare provision. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the evidence we have on now. Let's start with parental leave schemes. Now there is a sizable literature on this, and what I decided to do in these lectures is really just to focus on my own work, but that's not because I don't think there's other great work out there. There's so many interesting papers on this, but it's kind of it was more natural for me to present the things I've done, and then we can try and relate it to how it compares to what other people have done. So I'm just going to show you some of the stuff I've done on parental leave. So specifically, let me say a little bit about this paper that I wrote jointly with Camille Landé, Johanna Posch, Andreas Steinhauer, and Josef Zweimüller. So there we look at parental leave reforms in Austria. So let me first describe a little bit about the setting in Austria and the policy changes there. So Austria was an early mover in terms of introducing paid parental leave. So a full year parental leave was introduced already in 1961. And then since that time, there's been a number of reforms that have changed the duration of parental leave. Most of those reforms have expanded the duration. Some reforms have scaled back as well. So there are three main reforms that we use here. One is the 1990 reform, which increased the duration of parental leave from 12 months to 24 months. And there was a 96 reform that scaled it back again from 24 to 18 months. And then finally a 2000 reform that increased it from 18 to 13 months. In the paper, we look both at the 1961 introduction of parental leave and then those three subsequent reforms in 1990, 1996, and 2000. The nice thing about looking at all three reforms is you can really map out the effects of parental leave over a very wide span of durations, right? Basically going from 0 to 30 months. So you can sort of look at whether these effects are different at baseline, you know, at different baselines. In this talk here, in the interest of time, let me just focus on these 3 reforms. Now, as with many other parental leave reforms, eligibility was based on a cutoff date for the birth of the child with no grandfathering, and they were announced, close enough, like, well less than 9 months before the actual implementation. So there was very little room for gaming the system. So it's as with many other settings, it's one of those settings where you just have a very nice opportunity for the person who's trying to design. Now, in terms of where are these schemes binding? I put that here. It's worth just noting. So take the 1993 reform, right? It goes from 12 to 24 months. That sounds like event year 1, right? So you have your child in event year 0. So when I talk about event times here, to clarify that, I'm talking about event times in my child penalty graphs. Event times relative to the birth of the first child. There's also event time relative to when the reform was introduced. Forget about that. This is event time relative to the birth of the first child. 12 to 24 months sounds like event time 1. That's clearly treated by this one. But do remember that event time 0 is the year in which you have your first child, and you can have your first child throughout that. So not everyone is fully treated by having a kid at event year 0. So for example, if on average people have their kid in the middle of that year, then they're going to have, in event time measured in months, they're going to have 6 event months in year 0. And then they're going to go from 16 to 18 in year 1 and from 18 to 30 in year 2. So when you expand parental leave from 12 to 24, you're treating event times 1 and 2. And by that same logic, when you then decrease it from 24 to 18, you're now treating event time 2. And then when you increase it again, you're treating event time 2 again, but in the opposite direction. There are going to be some people at the tails as well. This is just based on the average, sort of a representative agent thinking. But most of the people, this is for the most part where you expect to see the effects of these event times. Okay, so let me show you how the order works. So let's just focus first on the 1990 reform. So eligibility was based on having a child after the 1st of July of 1990. And so now we can look at different outcomes, for example, earnings, with respect to the birth date of the first child. So this first graph here looks at earnings at event time -3. So 3 years before you have a kid, but plotted against the child's date of birth 3 years later. Okay. So obviously we don't expect to see any treatment effect here because you don't have the child yet. And consistent with that, the RD doesn't gives it clear 0 effect 3 years before birth. Similarly, 2 years before, 1 year before. Then there's the year in which you have your child. Remember, so this is year 0. Year 0 is not treated by this expansion of parental leave because the first 12 months were already covered. That's year 0. Consistent with that, you still see a 0 effect here. Now, one thing you may notice is, of course, just the functional form changed a lot between year -1 and that. That's the child penalty. So remember, this is again about when in year 0 you have your child. So if you have your child in the beginning of year 0 is almost fully treated by having a kid and your earnings will be low. If you have your child at the end of year 0, you're almost unaffected by a child in that year. And that means that your earnings are going to go back to almost the level they are the year before. So that increasing slope, that's just the treatment intensity of the child in year 0. Then we come to year 1. That's the first one where the parental leave reform is binding. And you can see now there's a negative effect, right? So we introduce paid parental leave in year 1 after having a kid, when previously there was none. And people respond to that incentive. They stay at home with their kid, and you have a negative impact on annual earnings. That's year 1. And then again in year 2, that's the other event year. That's also directly, the parental leave scheme eligibility is directly binding in event year 2. And again, you have a negative effect. So there's this negative effect on parental leave. Now, these negative effects are not very surprising, right? We subsidize staying at home with your kids, and people stay home with their kids, and so they lose labor market earnings during these years. That's not really the concern, the potential concern about parental leave schemes. That's just whether, you know, if you're willing to pay for that, you're willing to pay for that as a government policy. The concern about it is that these effects last over time due to labor market dynamics, right? So the concern is now women have been out for a year more. They've lost labor market experience, and that could have longer run impact on their careers through human capital formation, job market signaling, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole concern is that now things are going to keep going. If they don't, it's pretty good news for parental leave. So let's look at year 3. Nothing, nothing. Absolutely no dynamics here in the subsequent years. So there's just a direct mechanical effect of this policy in the 2 event years where it's binding, and then after that, there's no effect. So that's pretty good news for this parental leave scheme. So translating that into these child penalty graphs, we can do that, right? Because now we have these RD estimates of what happens in every single event year relative to having a child. And so the treatment impact on event study, the child penalty event study of parental leave schemes look like this. So the blue one that's the baseline child penalty graph for families for women that are ineligible for this longer parental leave scheme. And then we use the RD estimates at every different point in event time to draw the counterfactual child penalty graph for those that are eligible. And it just reflects the RD patterns I've shown you. There is just a negative effect in these 2 years, but then there is nothing thereafter. And you can do that same thing with the 1996 scaling back of parental leave and the year 2000 strong expansion of parental leave. And what you see there, if you go through the RD graph first and then use the RD estimates to draw graphs like this, you get something that is 100% consistent. So the 96 reform, remember, scale back parental leave, again, from 24 to 18 months. They're treating event time 2, but in the opposite direction, now giving a stronger incentive to go back to the labor market. And consistent with that, the child penalty at event time 2 is smaller than it was without the parental leave scheme. But there is no, in this case, we would look for a positive dynamic effect. And then the 2000 reform expands the parental leave scheme again, creating a negative effect, but only in the specific year where it's binding. So this suggests that maternity parental leave is neither the culprit nor the solution for child penalties and gender inequality. They have very limited effects when they're binding, but really no effects on long run penalties. Yeah.
We often hear the criticism of Danish data that's from this weird society that's not really like any other human society, right?
Yeah.
So then we have the pleasure of
Pointing asking that about Austria.
It's a really weird society, right? Basically, we not work anyway, right? And the non-long-run effect that you find, you could imagine that was actually different in this wonderful society.
Very good question. Yeah, so as we discussed in Austria, Central Europe is very gender conservative. And Austria is part of that group. They have really large child penalties, very conservative norms, etc. They're not as strong outliers as Switzerland, for example, but certainly they are a conservative outlier. So I think what's really nice about this is that the combination of many different reforms in the data we have allows us to really map out these effects in a very precise way and related to child penalties. So I think that's nice here, but the good thing is that there's actually pretty large literature by now on these parental leave schemes. And so we have evidence from Norway, we have evidence from Germany, we have evidence from the US, we have evidence from a host of other countries. And the story is pretty consistent. There really aren't really long-run effects of parental leave. They have short-run effects on labor supply in the direction that we would expect, but they don't do a lot in the long run. it's maybe a little bit surprising given the larger literature on experience effects. And think about why, although, I mean, a lot of the literature on experience effects, maybe we're still not completely confident about what it is we're estimating in that literature, whether that's really so well identified. But I guess one story, we believe in big experience effects. I think one story behind this is that what we're capturing here is the impact of parental leave on the earnings of the compliers, that is those that are pushed by the reform to take more leave. And so maybe people internalize these dynamic effects so that the women that are reacting to the policy by staying at home, also those who already foresee that they're not dynamic, very dynamic effective. That would be one.
So if you take this logic further, I guess, so in Europe, we're talking about sharing maternity between men and women.
Yeah.
So you'd say, well, if you do that, then you just see like a slightly smaller penalty in the first year, and then everything else will stay the same, or?
Yeah, so there is, of course, a massive discussion on this kind of earmarked paternity leave. Clearly, just taking this evidence at face value suggests whatever that's going to do, it's not going to be the solution. That's at a high level what this suggests. Now, of course, we want to be careful before we know more about these. Like I think a lot of the discussion about earmarked paternity leave is predicated on the idea that by forcing fathers to take leave in the beginning, that's somehow going to affect the preferences of families, the social norms regarding the involvement of fathers in childcare and have knock-on effects. And so maybe there is sort of this kind of social norm effect of that particular policy that we don't see here. And it's not just about that particular policy, but of course the social norm effect is a general equilibrium effect. And here there's always like the advantage of this quasi-experimental stuff is that it's very well identified, but it's of course partial equilibrium. So we're not getting any GE effect, including social norm effects. So I think that story out there about paternity leave, we don't really have the evidence yet to sort of say whether that's really going to happen. And there are a few papers, but we're soon going to get a lot more reforms in Europe with this paternity leave that I think is a good opportunity to analyze this. But I agree, on a high level, you see this, you're thinking, the design, I mean, my own sense is that there is a little bit of an excessive focus. Like if you look at the public debate, the media debate, certainly when I'm asked by journalists to talk about these things, a lot of it is about questions about the specific design of parental leave schemes. And I think there's a bit of an excessive focus on that particular question, given what we've discussed over the last 3 days. It doesn't seem to be where the solutions problems are. Yeah.
So those on the red line that are affected by the parental leave reform, they might have several children within that window. So I thought it was a bit weird that they are actually parallel after year 3. Shouldn't there be like?
No, because what's happening. So I think the question. Yeah. So both the blue ones. So I guess what you're saying is whether there could be 2 interpretations of your question. One interpretation you're saying the blue guys.
Not affected by the reform.
They will be affected by the parental leave scheme for future kids. Because if the blue people have a child later, that child will be born later than 1st of July 1990, or here's 1st of July 1996 for their next child. So it's really the effect of having one child eligible, your first child eligible versus not having your first child eligible. That's a treatment effect here. The second child and so on will be equally affected by parental leave in the that was one interpretation of question. Another interpretation of question is whether this has impacts on fertility. We look at that, but it doesn't. Okay. So that's parental leave. Sorry, there are, yeah.
Do we know how these graphs look by skill level of the mother? Related. These dynamics, thinking about dynamics.
Yeah, thinking about experience effect by. I mean, of course, that's something, I can't tell you off the top of my head. We did do something that early on in the project, we did look at heterogeneity by skill level. That's a long time ago. We don't currently have anything on that. And I don't want to just say something based on how I remember these things. Okay, so then the other key family policy that we might think have an effect is childcare provision. And we look at that in the same Austrian paper, because there's also been a ton of change over time in Austria in provision of subsidized public childcare. And a problem, you might think that that's much more of a solution, right? With the parental leave schemes, we're mostly concerned that it might be a problem. We're subsidizing people to stay at home with the children, and that may be part of the problem. With childcare provision, we think of that usually as, you know, a key part of the solution. We need to make it possible for women to work and have children at the same time. Okay, so what we use here, again for Austria, is that we have granular information on supply of nursery care institutions and preschool care institutions. And so, so we know every single childcare institution, either nursery or preschool. We know how many teachers are in the institution. We know the teacher-to-child ratios allowed in these institutions, and we know the opening hours of institution. And so with all of this, we can create a very precise measure of childcare supply. And our measure is this index that really captures the fraction of children in a given place in a given year that have access to full-time daycare. And then we want to use local expansions in this childcare supply to identify the effects. And our outcome, again, is going to be the child count. Okay, so it's basically a difference in differences design where we compare municipalities with large and sudden expansions of childcare to municipalities that do not have such an expansion. And so just give you a sense of the variation in Austria, here are heat maps of the change in childcare provision, childcare supply in different municipalities of Austria between 1990 and 2000, and between 2000 and 2010. So basically, what's going on here is that around year 1990, there was quite a bit of childcare in Vienna and the surroundings, and not so much in the rest of the country. And then what happened over the next 20 years is that the rest of Austria caught up with Austria. But the rest of Austria did so to different degrees and at different times. So that's why you have this incredibly granular variation. So the darker color here means big expansion in childcare supply. Lighter color means, well, the lightest color means a reduction in childcare supply. Light means very small expansion. And so you can see there's just a ton of very granular variation. And so we're going to use that in our research design. So basically what we're going to do, what's the concern, the general concern with this kind of design? The general concern is that these childcare expansions might not be exogenous, but rather a response to an underlying demand for childcare, which reflects labor supply changes that are already happening, right? So the concern is labor supply increase over time. That means families, mothers, they want more childcare, and therefore more childcare institutions is built, constructed. To avoid that kind of threat, what we're going to focus are very large and sudden changes in childcare provision, and then look for very sharp changes, or look for changes in labor supply around those events. So in the first stage of what we do here, so this is nursery care, preschool care. So we pick municipalities that increase the childcare supply index by at least 20% in a single year against municipalities that don't do that. And so this is the supply of nursery care for the treated group. And what you can see is that it's a very big change. It's in 1 year, these municipalities are increasing childcare supply by about 40 percentage points. You're moving almost halfway between no childcare and full-time childcare for everyone. And in the controlled municipalities, it's just smooth. Okay, and so we can do event study around that, and we don't think that's particularly vulnerable to these sort of endogenous changes in demand, which means they're gradual. And similarly here with preschool care, a very large and strong change. Then we just do a different event study. And so let's look at nursery care first. And it looks like this. So on the left, the outcome is earnings 1 year before birth, and on the right, outcomes of earnings 1 to 2 years after birth. This is just a placebo, of course. We really don't want to see an effect here, and we're not seeing an effect here. That would be a problem for the empirical design if we did. The other one, that's where we expect to see an effect if there's an effect of childcare, because that's earnings 1 and 2 years after birth. That's precisely when nursery care is binding. And as you can see here, this is a very precise zero. There's really no effect. So the two groups track each other. Before, this is the, here event time knows this is probably the only graph. No, it's not the only, it's one of my own graphs where event time is not now with respect to childbirth, it's with respect to the policy. What you can see here is we translate these effects into a treatment on the treated effect. That is, we scale the effects up there, which of course very, very small, by the change in the supply index, so as to get a TOT effect, which is the effect of moving childcare from 0 to full supply for everyone. And that effect is just 3.1% on earnings, and it's statistically insignificant.
So can you say something about the quality of this care? Because I would as a parent, the quality of the nursery care, I would as a parent be a bit concerned that now everything is new, so maybe the child is not taken care of that well.
So the quality is supposed to be good, but I think an even better, rather than talking about quality, maybe the better thing is to talk about the part of the first stage that I didn't show you, right? So here, previous graph here, so this is the first stage, the increase in the supply, but in some sense, the real first stage is the increase in take-up. Did people actually put their children in this childcare? If they did, it was apparently high quality enough for them to do that. And there's a ton of take-up. So childcare increased, families put their children in these institutions. So now the children are taken care of in institutional care, and yet nothing happens to earnings or employment. And you get the exact same picture for preschool care expansions. There's just no effect of these things, which may seem probably surprising. I certainly came from the view a few years ago that childcare was one of those policies that would have a large impact. I've even said that in papers, not any evidence, but apparently I'm wrong. So, yeah.
So I actually wanted to look at this in the context of Denmark, but there's this regional variation. Have you looked at the grandparents and their earnings and so on in here? Because maybe if Austria is a more conservative society, what happens is that once your parental leave is over, you give the kids to the grandparents.
I agree completely, and yes, we looked at it, and I will now say something about it. So we have this precisely estimated 0 effect on child penalties, and we want to think about, how's that, make any sense? Before getting to that, let me just point out, so this, like with parental leave schemes, there's a literature on this, and other papers have looked at the impact of child care provision. Unlike parental leave, I think the results are much more mixed in this literature. Some papers find effects, some papers don't find effects. There are a number of other papers on Norway, the US, France, Spain that either find no effect or very small effects, but we also have some studies, like there's a well-known one based on Quebec in Canada that seem to find large effects. Now, there are differences in research designs and identification across these papers, so maybe one interpretation is that we believe some estimates more than others. But I think leaving that aside, I think it is one of those questions where it's very natural to expect that the results will be context specific. And so to really understand the effect of childcare is one of those areas where understanding mechanisms is really key. And specifically, the question we have with childcare is the degree to which it crowds out other forms of childcare that are already there. It seems very natural that the impacts of this must be very different depending on the baseline market for childcare. And I think there are two kinds of childcare that are going on before, right? One is care by relatives, that was yours, and the other one is market provided childcare. Now, Austria is not the country, so this is important maybe for a country like the US. Austria's more here, and we actually provide evidence on this in the paper. It's more suggestive when we come to that, but we provide suggestive evidence that indeed expansion of childcare crowded out care by relatives. So children put their children with grandmothers to begin with, and then as childcare was expanded, they moved them from the grandmothers to the childcare institutions, but without working more. So yeah, I think maybe part of the reasons for these variation results across paper has to do with the baseline situation and the degree of crowd out. But still, I would say there are a bunch of papers here that find limited effects, which sort of again go to my general conclusion here is that overall public policy compared to the enormous amount of variation we've talked about on Monday and Tuesday in these child penalties, the role of policy seems we're explaining a very small part of the variation. Which that's something I've talked to a bunch of you about over the last few days. I think that's kind of one of the high level views I have this question and on economics more generally is that we are as economists, we have been very focused on the impact of incentives, policies. We feel that we're on safe ground there and we kind of know how to analyze these things using various quasi-experimental techniques and so on. But my general impression is that in a lot of contexts, we're explaining a very, very small part of the variation. Most of the variation is really about something else. Those things are often harder to analyze. One aspect is this whole question of social norms and culture. Once you move in there, you're on a much less comfortable ground and things are more suggestive. So it's harder to go in there, but I do think that these things are potentially incredibly important and that we should move into that space where maybe a lot of the variation is. Again, the one policy that I found was this to have an effect, a sizable effect even, was welfare benefits. And I think actually it's kind of interesting to just link that together with what I found with parental leave, because I think it's totally consistent, right? Parental leave also has an effect in the years where it binds, but nothing beyond that. If you think about a generous welfare system, what is that? Well, that's really permanent parental leave. So it works in every year, and that's why it has big impacts. So I think the short-run effects of temporary parental leave and the permanent effects of welfare benefits are very much in line with each other. But overall, as I said, I feel gender convergence is perhaps less about government intervention and more about general equilibrium aspects. And by that, I mean really the labor market equilibrium is one, and sort of norms and culture is another big one. And I don't know how I am with time, but it's I'm
You're very fine with time.
I'm good. This is my last slide. So
from break, but we still have 5 minutes for question.
So I wanted to ask about the normative language you use in this lecture in particular. So you talk about penalties and solution to penalties, which I guess means eradicating or eliminating them. So I was wondering whether you could justify that this would be good for the society, apart from, you know, noticing that it would reduce the exposed inequality between genders, right? But do we see any evidence? Well, this is wild, but for instance, women moving from countries with big penalty to countries with small penalty.
So I'm actually maybe not in these talks when I'm just sort of talking off the cuff, but in the papers we write on this, we're actually very careful to not use normative language because we're very far away from welfare analysis here. The word child penalty simply refers to the fact that it captures the opportunity cost of having children. It is a penalty on labor market outcomes. As we talked about on Monday, it's not necessarily a penalty on life satisfaction. It's not a welfare thing, but it's just a penalty in terms of labor market outcomes. It's true, I do talk about solutions to this and that, I think, because there is a view among people, including myself, that we want to reduce gender inequality. And there's just sort of a big discussion about how to do that. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is that gender inequality in a lot of high-income countries is virtually identical to the child penalty. And so solving the problem of gender inequality means eliminating child penalties. We talked about the kind of things that go into that. But it's not welfare. Like, you can take different views about where these, even if it's, of course, if it were all biology, something I've pushed against. I don't believe in that. But if this were all just biology, well, then there's really nothing to correct here. Now I'm pushing more towards social norms and culture, but welfare analysis with social norms and culture is actually very tricky to think about. You know, sometimes norms are there to sustain a good equilibrium. It's not necessarily welfare proving to break a social norm, to change a social norm. So I think welfare analysis is tricky, but that's a very economist way of thinking about it. I think in the world, we want to reduce gender inequality, and we're sort of providing some evidence and some tools to try and think about how to do that.
It's super cool, really. But I thought it's kind of strange that policy doesn't have any effects if you think about it. So I was wondering whether you have a view on how policy might interact with norms in the long run, because clearly also here in Denmark, you know, 40 years ago it was not uncommon for women to stay at home, and that was perceived as like the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Today it's completely gone, but at the same, in that period, there has been this massive rollout of daycare, and maybe it's just a really slow moving process of changing norms that is induced by those policies.
That I agree with. That is certainly one of the things we're thinking about. It's very hard. So that's this book, right? Public policy can have GE effects. One of those GE effects could be an effect on norms. None of our designs are really set up to capture that, right? Because
Is your cross-country, when you collect all these data cross-country, is that with the aim of?
So that's one of the things we have in mind, is really to begin to then document all the things that might be relevant in different countries, policy design, norms measures, relevant things about industrial composition, et cetera, some of all these different things we've talked about. And so just seeing what kinds of things predict child penalties in different places and over time. It's never going to be as conclusive as the kind of evidence I've shown you here today, but it allows us to look at more, just have much more variation and think about there are other ways in which you can think about the impact of policy on social norms. Let me give you the example I talked about in the beginning of the lecture today was welfare reform in the 90s in the US. That is one policy that I think had massive effects on female labor supply in the US. And something I discussed in my paper on that is that one of the propagation mechanisms could precisely have been that it changed social norms regarding women being on welfare in the US. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's an important question. Maybe that is an important effect of public policy, and I think we want to go there, but it's difficult.
So thank you very much. Super interesting. I want to ask also, how much do you consider social norms or sort of work culture related to men's work? Because I know that they don't have a job, right? I understand that, but it could be that they increase productivity by working 2 hours, so they sort of keep the earnings for this also.
Well, men are completely unaffected, not just in terms of earnings, but in terms of hours worked, employment, and wage rates. It's literally occupation. Everything is a non-event for fathers.
I'm mindful.
So we talked about the baseline stuff yesterday, and in a way, maybe these zero results also indicate that a lot of these things will impact not only the sort of what happens exactly at the time of birth, but also sort of the baseline, what you're comparing with before, even all the choices that young couples make before they even start thinking about having children in terms of occupational choices, education choices, and so on.
Yeah, so I think the idea is that one sort of mechanism is that policies affect choices before you have kid, educational choices, investments in labor market investment, and so on. I mean, it's true. I mean, the one thing we of course have in all these graphs are very tight and parallel pre-trends. They typically just go back 5 years, but we have some evidence for the pre-trends, and they don't suggest these anticipation effects. I'm less worried about that in the context of, say, Austria or Denmark, but yeah, when we compare Africa to Europe, But let me just say in general, in terms of the high level point that I made here, that child penalties explain most of the gender inequality we see in high income countries. If they're on top of the child penalties or these kind of anticipatory effect, that reinforces that main point even more. Right? So we can explain 80% of gender inequality are only in child penalties, and then on top of that, people are already making to say that, for example, women's tendency to go into humanities instead of STEM, if that's also an ex-ante child penalty, then children can explain even more than 80% of gender inequality.
Perfect. I think we are all time. So thank you so much.